Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where we explore how to engage and align everyone in an organisation to execute continuous improvement and innovation. This show brings you insights from global experts and practitioners who share their journeys in creating cultures of excellence to deliver sustainable results and a better future.
I'm your host, Brad Jeavons. It is such a pleasure to have Mr. Alex Smith on the show with us today. If you think strategy means buzzwords, bingo in the boardroom, Alex M.H. Smith will make you think again. He's the author of a book that shows founders and CEOs how to think and lead with clarity instead of jargon. As a strategy advisor to some of the world's most interesting brands, Alex's framework forces focus and inspires bold action. His large LinkedIn and YouTube audiences follow him for one reason. He makes strategy simple, practical, and real. Let's get to the episode. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot for having me, especially at 4 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah, listeners, it is early in Brisbane, but it supports global podcast recording. So, Alex, what's your background, mate? Like, what led you down to this path of strategy, which, depending on where you sit, is becoming common or less common in companies at the moment?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, common or less common. Yeah, both of those things are simultaneously true. I guess coming down to how you actually define what strategy is. I mean, for me, it's been a very unusual journey because I have no background in, knowledge of, or I would even perhaps go so far as to say interest in strategy at all. I was sort of accidental strategy guy because I didn't work for any of the big firms, and I never worked for a company that did this. But I used to work in the field basically of advertising in an agency, and I sort of reached the top of that particular company, which was, you know how it is with some of these small businesses. You know, you can kind of be at the top at 29, and then you've got nowhere to go. And I thought, oh right, well, what am I going to do now? And all I really did was I had this idea from looking at companies that essentially I just thought were really cool at the time. You know, your sort of Patagonia, Lush, Tesla. These were the sort of companies that people were really sort of paying attention to. Monster, and I developed this sort of theory around why these companies were doing well, which I described as embedded creativity. And my whole idea at the time, I thought I was very, very clever, was that some companies, because bearing in mind, I was coming at this from like an advertising lens. And I thought, well, some companies, they're just so damn interesting, just intrinsically in what they do and the way that they are, that they don't really need to sort of like put lipstick on the pig by doing fancy creative advertising, because they're just inherently interesting. And I was like, wow, is that? So how is that? And I developed this kind of like body of theory about what these businesses were doing. And I sort of had it underneath this tagline, like I called "Make Interesting Companies, Not Interesting Advertising." This was my sort of original idea. And I went out there and I tried to sell this. Anyway, wasn't very successful at selling that at all. But fast forward like 5 or 6 years, and essentially I found that what I'd done as I managed to sort of like find a variation of this that I could get people to pay me for, was I'd sort of accidentally reverse engineered my way into classical business strategy, the sort of thing that you'd recognize from like Porter and Roger Martin and Blue Ocean Strategy and all of that stuff. Even though I'd never read any of these books and didn't know anything about it, gradually I started to realize it was sort of the same thing. And at first I was like really like disappointed with this, because I thought, wow, my amazing original insights are not actually original at all. I guess there's nothing new under the sun. But what was good about it is that I had kind of inadvertently come up with a new language of talking about the same old concepts, or like certainly 80-90% the same concepts. And, you know, when you come up with a new language about something, you make it accessible to a different group of people, and you make people think about the same thing that perhaps they thought they knew in a different way. And so that's kind of where I then got my big sort of breakout on LinkedIn, and I wrote the book. And so, yeah, I think that really like what it fundamentally comes down to now is that, you know, I I don't have any sort of like particularly strong disagreements with the classical school of strategy at all. I think it's all brilliant stuff. But unfortunately, it's stuff that most business leaders, for whatever reason, they just don't pay attention to, or they don't, or if they think they're paying attention to it, they're getting the wrong end of the stick, not really. And so I think that maybe like I'm now able to kind of like really bring that thinking to a wider pool of people.
Yeah, I think Alex is a good point, mate, because full respect to Michael Porter, the guy's a legend. But I don't know of many people who are going to plow through competitive strategy or competitive advantage at the minute. Like that is one
Sadly,
thick
they
book.
should, but they won't.
But it's so true what you say as well. I see around Australia anyway, is that strategy is so important, so important, and connecting everyone to it is so important. But it seems like we've lost our way with it. Like we've just been, I guess, making money beside ourselves because of maybe fluctuations in economies and things like that. So, Alex, what led you down to the path to put it into a book? Because it's a really cool book, short, sharp, to the point that you've written. What put you down that path, particularly when you had this LinkedIn channel going to share knowledge and information?
Well, the true answer is that I just thought it would be a good look to say I was an author, and I didn't think anyone would read the book. So I just wrote the quickest thing that I could possibly write. I mean, I think I wrote the whole book in about 4 days or something like
Oh,
that. And it
well
was just
done.
like, here's like, I was just like, let's just write down whatever I think about strategy and be done with it. Because who cares? No one's going to read it anyway. But it's always the things that you put the least effort into that end up being the most worthwhile and meaningful. And this was definitely the case with that, because now the things become this sort of huge hit, despite me having no kind of particular no strategy for the book. Actually, like I say, the only purpose was to actually just get it written and get it done. And yeah, it's crazy now, it's been bulk bought by Procter and Gamble and Porsche and Aura Ring and all this sort of stuff. And like I say, it really was a completely cynical marketing pamphlet as far as I was concerned. And there's so then after the fact that people talk about it and you see what the book was kind of for. Um, Even because, like I say, I didn't have a sort of like, okay, what the world needs is me to write this book about blah 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 blah. It turns out that maybe like for some people they did need that, but it was only after the fact that I realized it. And I think that one element of it was simply just making the concepts, the Porter-esque concepts, much more accessible and intuitive. But I think there's actually a deeper thing as well where, and I don't know, we could talk about this. I see like this goes back to your original point about like is strategy becoming more or less common. And the thing is that as we know, it is this sort of like broad bullshitty word. And we could say that
Yeah.
anything that you do to try and improve your business could be called strategy. So like that would be a fair summation. But what I write about in the book is actually really, and the sort of things that I would also say that Porter writes about, this is actually really a very narrow subset of strategy, which is a much more aggressive and creative and sort of romantic, I would actually say, version of strategy where you're pushing a lot you're pushing a lot harder at creating something new, bringing something new into the world, and to some extent, disrupting a market. And like I said, you said before, well, strategy is very important, but no one pays any attention to it. And people have been making money anyway. And that's the truth. That is the truth that like the reason that most people don't pay attention to Porter is because fundamentally you can make a successful business without doing any of that stuff. And we've seen it 1,000 times over. Because I think that just being competent in a really boring, mediocre way has for a long time, for the past 30, 40 years, it's basically been enough, I think. But what I think is that now we are entering a moment, particularly with like AI and all that kind of thing, where the era of competence, I really think is over, because competence is going to be so democratized, and it's going to be that higher level of business, that more ambitious, that more disruptive and creative type of business. That is going to be the new bar to success. So although these are very old ideas, certainly like the way that Porter or whoever puts them, I think that maybe they're moving from being a luxury form of business to perhaps in the next few years being a necessity.
Mm. I think too, so when I look at Porter, he wrote the books in the what 70s and 80s, and then you also had a lot of our listeners love lean and continuous improvement, right? These guys were doing that after the Second World War through to the 60s, 70s, which is like hard times. Like I think Porter wrote his books in tough times, and Tachiano and these guys wrote their books in tough times. And
Yeah.
I think tough times force you to be slick at strategy because only the tough are going to
Yeah.
win. Everyone else is going to tank. And I agree with you. I think potentially we're heading into an era where technology is going to allow people to disrupt a lot harder and faster, but also potentially the economy isn't easy. It's getting harder, isn't it? So
I mean, the economy's getting harder. And then I think, I mean, I would expect the technology, obviously, people are always going to rush to whatever is easy and cheap because that's natural. But unfortunately, people always forget that whatever is easy and cheap is what everyone is doing, and so that is going to represent the that's going to represent the kind of the average performance in the market. And so it's the only people who are going to get outsized results are always going to be the people who are prepared to step across a boundary that most other people don't step past. And and I do think that the strategy principles, one way of thinking about them is that they define a way of doing business which is very kind of contrarian and outlierish because it's all about obviously contradicting your category and building upon like and sort of building something new which hasn't been seen before in your market. And most businesses don't do that. Most businesses are, me two, me three, me four kind of businesses who are just there to try and get their piece, their tiny little sliver of maybe a shrinking pie. And that's fine because, to your point, maybe not in the 70s, but certainly like the 90s and noughties, well, whatever, like the internet was there, things were booming, things were growing. You could just make these generic, boring, uninspired kind of widget like businesses, and it was going to work. And I think that so much business advice that you see out there is about, how do you build a better widget on a grand scale? Uh, and yeah, like I mean, obviously we'll sort of talk about it, but like real competitive advantage focused strategy, no bullshit strategy, whatever. It's not about that. And in fact, I would almost go so far as to say that I kind of disdain that. I disdain the view of business which is all about optimization and incrementalism and tweaking things and doing everything 5% better, 10% better. It's I don't know. It's like it works, but at the same time, I think it's no way to live.
yeah, only if you can use it in a way to create such a cost competitive position that you can totally out destroy your competition in that regard. And Alex, what would you say, mate, are the key components then that you've discovered to really create this no bullshit strategy that leads to competitive advantage? Because we're talking about competitive advantage, is that you clearly have unique positions that are valuable to a base of customers, isn't it? Like you're clearly unique and valuable. What is it? What's the key components that you'd say is a way for a company to go about it?
Well, so the most basic way that you can think about it, and it's so basic that nobody bothers to think about it this way, but they really should because it's easy to forget, is we all understand the principles of supply and demand. Therefore, we all understand that the perfect business is a business that's got very high demand and very low supply, by which I mean they are the only supplier of that thing. If you have a business that sells something that loads of people want and you're the only game in town for that thing, then you are going to make money, no problem, even if your business is horribly run. You can have terrible marketing and your culture can be an absolute train wreck and all this stuff, but you're still going to make money because of those basic principles. Um, and so to me, strategy the first goal of strategy fundamentally is to figure out, right, what can we do that's good that loads of people are going to want but which people can get from nowhere other than us. And of course 99% of businesses, they have no answer to that question because either most commonly, yes, they do make something that people want, but unfortunately they can get it from all their competitors too. And then occasionally you get a second type of business where it's sort of the reverse problem, where they do something unique, but unfortunately the demand is really low because people don't quite get it, or because it's got a really sort of niche market. I call this like the vegan dog food problem. I've had many people come up to me in the past and say like, Alex, I've got this all figured out. We're the only vegan dog food in the whole world. We're golden. And I'm like, the reason you're the only vegan dog food is in the whole world is because there's no demand for it. Like you've just swapped one problem for another. So to be able to get into that sort of very rare zone where you have both sides of that equation figured out, that's extremely unusual, and that is fundamentally the goal of strategy. And then the reason that most people never, not only getting there is obviously very difficult, even if you know what you're doing, but the issue is that most people, they completely misunderstand the path to get there, because most business leaders, they have this very natural default assumption that to win in their market, the way that they do that is to basically become better than their competitors. So they put all of their energy into outperforming their competitors. But you've got to think about like the meaning of the words here. The word better, if we actually just kind of step back from it, the word better is a synonym for the same. If you say that A is better than B, what you're actually saying is that A and B are the same things. They do the same job, but A does it 5-10% more, whatever. And so that means that any attempt to become better than your competitors will actually only result in you becoming more and more similar to them. And that basically drives commodification and a race to the bottom and all the rest of that stuff that we want to avoid. And the only winner in a market like that is never the best product or the best company. It's the most famous one, or the one that's got the most money to spend on marketing or something like that. But unfortunately, what we see is that like almost every business on the planet is operating to a sort of unconscious playbook of how do we become better than the other guy, when really what they should be thinking about is essentially how do we become completely separate from the other guy? How do we become completely distinct? We let them have their part of the market, whatever that might be. We let them have their strengths. We let them have their customers. Whilst we go over here and we do something that's completely incompatible with that, but we know is fundamentally like not competitive with it. And then that's where you have that potential to create that unique value, that high demand, low supply that we're all searching for. So unfortunately, like I say, the fundamental issue is that people are intuitively thinking about the problem all wrong from the ground up.
Mm. It's a really good point, isn't it? Because I guess if you can find that unique market to that unique persona, that is, or that segment, and then have that clear, unique product that only you hold, it's going to give you that real potential to make solid margin out of it and strategically win. What sort of techniques have you seen, Alex, for companies to go about this to really start to unpack? Because I guess a lot of companies will have their legacy markets, their legacy products, their legacy what they do, which I guess can be a blinker on this type of thinking. How would you suggest they go about really understanding, right, where is that uniqueness? What could it be?
Well, going back to what I said earlier on about how if you sort of choose the average path, then you are by definition going to be average. It's a funny thing when you start to go through all this strategy stuff. It's kind of an iron law within it is that at every single step of the process, you basically have to do the opposite of what seems to be the sensible thing to do. And again, when you think about it, that makes sense, because obviously if you kept on doing the sensible thing, everyone's capable of doing the sensible thing. So we all end up in the same place. So at every stage, whatever seems to be the right thing to do, you kind of just need to go against that. And so one of the first ways that you do that is principle number one is that you probably need to sacrifice something of value within your market. So if you are, I don't know, I'm making this up, in the world of laundry detergents, everybody agrees that it's very important to get your whites white. So that would be like a vector of competition within that category. So a smart thing to do in that situation would be not to get your whites even whiter, but to think about, if we were to actually just fundamentally not get whites white, if we were to fail at that, would that open up any new opportunities which would be impossible for all those other companies to go after because they really value that particular thing? Now, off the top of my head, I can't think of any good reason why you would have a laundry detergent that wouldn't get the whites white, but you can be surprised if you
Get the
take
colors brighter.
thoughts.
Get the colors
Right,
brighter.
right, okay, fine, yeah, exactly, yeah, maybe that's what it would do. There you go. So it doesn't take a lot of thinking to look beyond a sacrifice, beyond something which on the face of it seems bad or stupid, to then discover, wait, well, actually, no, hang on, there's a whole new world of value on the other side of this. And connected to this is another thing which I believe passionately. And this is, like I said, most of my beliefs are completely in line, I'd say, with like the classical strategy orthodoxy. There are only a few places where I say things that really annoy people. And one of them is this, which is connected to that, which is that like I am very against the concepts of solving customer problems. Of course, as a matter of operational routine, not strategy, but just operational routine, yes, you should listen to your customers, you should understand your customers, you should try and obviously help them, blah, 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 blah. But that's a low-level tactical, just like tweaking thing. Strategically, it doesn't help you at all for the very obvious reason that every company in a given category is obsessed with listening to customers. And we're now in 2026. This is like, all of these markets are very mature. Anything that your customers say that they want has either been delivered to them a million times over, or it's impossible to deliver to them because of some, laws of physics or something. So like this notion of like understanding your customer and then solving their pain points or giving them what they want, this is never going to get you to a strategically defensible position, ever. Instead, what you have to do is you don't need to think about solving the problems that exist, about answering needs that already exist. This game is all about creating needs that didn't exist before. You have to generate your own demand. You have to generate your own needs. And again, the way that you do this is you don't put the customer at the start of your thinking process. You put them at the very, very end. So going back to that detergent thing there, you see, you actually need to start not with what does the customer want. You need to start with what would just be new. What would be something new and interesting and weird and hard to copy and kind of like and sort of anti-competitive? And then latterly, you ask the question, all right, under what circumstances would customers like this? Or what kind of customer would this work with? Or how would this fit into the customer's lives? You see, this sort of reverse engineered way, you're going to come up with completely new ideas that no one ever thought of. And people never think, all these people out there who are constantly talking about listening to customers and solving their problems, we never think that almost every one of the truly great, iconic, exciting businesses in the world, from like Apple to Tesla to Red Bull to everything else, none of these companies solved a customer problem. They all generated new need where no need existed. Nobody was asking for what these companies did. But when they saw it, they said, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way. I want that thing. And this really, like, there's the odd exception. Don't get me wrong. There's the odd exception where there's some low-hanging fruit and you can just go and pick it. But generally speaking, the only way in 2026 you're going to build a business like this is by generating your own need and then sort of like showing customers something that they never considered was a possibility and that they were never asking for, and that doesn't solve any problem that they thought that they had. But then, people will rationalize to themselves why they want these things. So I think that this is really the only reliable way that you come up with these kind of ideas.
Yeah. So that's really cool. So you're like talking that design thinking type, out of the box type. How do you push the boundaries with ideas of what could be uniquely different and what could we then sustain and control? And then how do we then experiment with that to see where can it land? Will this land? Where will this fly? Like, how would you then suggest a company consider then about going about testing these ideas and actually working on it strategically?
Well, it's important to note that like it isn't truly a blue sky exercise. And I mean, I guess if you're coming up with a whole new business, it might be. But you're working with the business that you have, aren't you? So it's like you aren't saying, so if you are in that, I don't know, detergent market or, I don't know, advertising agencies or whatever your industry is, you're not really, for the most part, you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. So you're normally, realistically, you're more looking to kind of discover what leverage the business already has so that you can double, triple, quadruple down on that thing. And what you typically find is that the real opportunities or points of leverage for a given business are things which nobody in the company is currently thinking about, things that they took for granted, things that were perhaps complete accidents, sometimes things that even go completely against what the management thinks are the important things for that business. And the reason this answers your question is because what you typically find is that when you uncover these forms of leverage, and it will be like some often, for example, it might actually be an area where the company is really weak, and then you consider the possibility of, if you were even weaker at that, what new opportunities would that throw up, for example. Typically what you'll find is there will already be evidence that this stuff works kind of baked into the business as it is, and you're just kind of turning up the volume on it. So normally the validation is actually it's more straightforward than you think. It's normally self-evidently quite a good idea. I mean, something that I always say to clients is that that you've done the work right if the answer that you come to is something that everybody says, oh, well, that's really obvious, but simultaneously, nobody had ever said it before. If something is both obvious, but no one's ever said it before, that is the absolute pay dirt. So if you're in a situation where you're like, oh, well, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? Or we're really going to need to test this and research this. That's probably kind of like a bad signal in the first place. It's surprising how self-evident a lot of this stuff ends up being.
Wow, cool. So what you're saying is really they're potentially within your business, these things are already lingering around. It's just identifying those unique elements that are different to what's been going on traditionally, that potentially there's the chance to hold competitive advantage and customers being willing to pay for it. So to up your demand and then hold that supply position. That's unique.
Yeah. I mean, one of the great strategy examples, to be fair, I don't actually know how this happened internally, but whatever, it still illustrates the point. If you look at Nintendo and the Nintendo Switch, like they were never competitive with PlayStation and Xbox in terms of power, right? So Nintendo was already kind of like a sort of poor cousin for a long time, and it couldn't do all the stuff those consoles could do. But then they kind of owned their low power. They made the consoles smaller, they made it portable, and then they opened up the whole field of party gaming and in-person gaming, which had been completely abandoned by PlayStation and Xbox with all the online stuff. And then what do you know? They had this uncontested market space and they became the number one console in the world. So you see how like that wasn't like Nintendo taking this kind of blank slate look at the world of consoles and what could be done under all circumstances. It was really more an intensification of their existing, at the time, maybe quite sort of weak position.
Yeah. But they found that niche position in there to play in that was unique to their competition to work on. It's good. What's been the major insight you've had through this journey that you've really focused on for a long time, which is how to create unique organizations? What's been the major insight as you've gone along that journey?
God, the major insight to put it down to one. I mean, I think I don't think that this is necessarily what people in my audience care about so much, but I guess what I'm motivated by is that I think that it's quite a sad time of history that we live in, insofar as adventure and discovery and kind of romance are kind of things of the past, right? You can't set sail to distant lands anymore the way that you could. There's no more exploration to really be had if you exclude space anyway. Everything's very known. everything's very known, everything's very optimized, everything's very sort of predictable, and then it's getting even more so as people just sort of burrow their lives into their smartphones and all the rest of it, right? It is not an exciting or romantic time to be alive from a sort of average person's perspective. But what I see with business is that I think that it is an opportunity to actually bring a bit of that excitement and adventure into our lives. Like, you have to sort of create your own quest. But in order to do that, you have to run the business in a certain way. You actually have to take some risks, and you have to try and change things, and you have to try and like put something new and bold out there into the world, which isn't necessarily the way that most people think about business or do their business. But what I see strategy as really is, I see it as a kind of a playbook to having an adventurous life for the people who then use these techniques. And it's a little bit like, if you just follow this playbook, if you think about business this way and you go out there and you try and create something like this, you might succeed or you might fail, but you're going to have an interesting ride either way. And not a lot of us are having interesting rides, I think, at the moment, you know. So that's actually been kind of my motivation for it. Now, whether or not anyone who reads my books gives a damn about that, or if they're just like, you know, how can I make another buck? Maybe so, but it's nice that it's all the same thing.
Yeah, it is. And certainly it is. In the world of business, there is a massive opportunity and world of creation, isn't there? It's still one that we can explore new pastures and new directions. And I guess, like you've been saying, that's at the heart of competitive advantage is and strategy is, how can you be unique in a way that people will pay money for, and you've got competitive positioning on to be able to hold that. Alex, thanks for everything you have done and continue to do, mate, to push new boundaries and think differently, particularly around strategy. I can see that's going to crank up more and more in years to come as companies really need to focus in on how can we be better and do what we do in a more effective way. Alex, how can people reach out to you, connect, and learn more, or even get the book?
Yeah, well, my main platform is obviously on LinkedIn, so you can connect with me or follow me there. But what I did was, on my website, I put a page in. If you go to basicarts.org/welcome, that's actually got like a link to the book, and you can sign up to the newsletter and some other free resources there. But then, you know, and then of course, anyone's welcome to reach out to me too directly via the website.
Great. Alex, thanks again, mate. Thanks for all you've done and all you continue to do to help us create a better future, mate. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. Bye for now.
Thanks for having me.
See ya. What a great episode. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help others gain insights and create a better future. You can also go to the Enterprise Excellence website, enterpriseexcellencegroup.com.au, to be able to get hold of resources on strategy to help you find that niche, that position, and also Alex's own website there, where he mentioned to be able to get hold of and connect with him for future with his book and other information. There were two key takeaways for me from this episode. Firstly was Alex's focus on finding that new ground. What is that niche, and what is that completely new and different piece that you can focus on to drive competitive positioning that's sustainable? And the key part to me that he mentioned was that it may be within your capabilities already. I love that conversation around thinking about every aspect of your current business, but also these unique pieces that maybe we haven't thought of before or even lent into before that could hold that secret to competitive advantage. The second key insight for me was where strategy has evolved to potentially in many companies purely be optimization, which in the Enterprise Excellence Group, we still believe that optimization is important to sustain profitability and productivity, but really thinking of the two edges to it. How do we optimize and retain our positioning of productivity and performance, but then find that new ground that will truly drive some wealth and prosperity for all your organizations and those you serve, and help your customers with that unique positioning. Alex, thanks for coming on the show and pushing our thinking, and for everything you have done and continue to do to create a better future. Bye for now.